Every generation believes it's unique. But millennials are different in a very unusual way. They are the only generation old enough to remember a world without smartphones, yet young enough to have built their entire adult lives inside the internet. People often describe them as anxious, entitled, burned out, always online, always questioning everything. But what if none of those are personality flaws? What if they are psychological adaptations? Because the human mind doesn't develop in isolation, it adapts to the world around it, and few generations have experienced a world that changed as quickly or as dramatically as millennials did. Tonight, we're going beneath the stereotypes to uncover the hidden psychology that shaped an entire generation. Millennials were born during one of the most unusual transitions in human history. Older generations mostly experienced one world. Younger generations were born into another. But millennials lived through both. Many remember childhoods without Wi-Fi, without Google, without social media, without constant notifications. Friendships happened face to face. Arguments ended when everyone went home. Mistakes weren't permanently archived online. Privacy wasn't something people had to fight to keep. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. The internet stopped being a tool. It became the environment. Psychologists have long known that our surroundings shape the way we think, communicate, and solve problems. When environments change slowly, people adapt gradually. But when environments transform within a single generation, the mind has to rewrite many of its own rules. Millennials became the first generation forced to learn two completely different social operating systems, one analog, one digital. That transition demanded a level of psychological flexibility few generations had ever needed before. But it also came with a cost, because adapting never happens without leaving traces behind. And the first place those traces appeared was in identity itself. Earlier generations often built identity around permanence. One career, one hometown, one company, sometimes even one profession for life. Millennials inherited something very different. The world they entered rewarded reinvention. Technology changed industries almost overnight. Entire careers disappeared. New careers emerged from jobs that hadn't existed a decade earlier. Social media introduced something psychology had never encountered on such a massive scale: continuous public identity. Instead of asking, "Who am I?" many people unconsciously began asking, "How am I being seen?" Psychologists describe identity as something built through both internal reflection and external feedback. For millennials, that external feedback became nearly constant. Likes, comments, followers, algorithms. Every interaction became a tiny social signal. None of these systems created insecurity by themselves, but they dramatically increased opportunities for comparison. Research has consistently shown that people naturally evaluate themselves relative to others. The internet simply multiplied the number of comparisons from dozens to thousands every single day. Imagine trying to measure your success not against your neighborhood, but against millions of carefully edited highlight reels. The human brain was never designed for that. And yet millennials became the first generation asked to do exactly that. For decades, there was a simple promise: study hard, get a degree, find a stable job, buy a house, build a secure future. For many millennials, that promise became increasingly uncertain. Economic recessions, rapid globalization, automation, housing costs, student debt, constant technological disruption. The traditional roadmap became far less predictable. Psychologists know that uncertainty affects the brain in profound ways. When people cannot reliably predict future outcomes, they often become more vigilant, more adaptable, but also more mentally exhausted. Instead of planning one lifelong career, many millennials prepared for several. Instead of expecting stability, they learned to expect change. This wasn't pessimism, it was adaptation. And adaptation often looks strange to people who grew up under different conditions. What one generation calls job hopping, another experiences as survival. What one generation calls lack of loyalty, another sees as protecting itself from uncertainty. The environment changed. So the psychology changed too. Previous generations often inherited information. Millennials learned to search for it. Instead of waiting for answers, they learned to investigate. Search engines, forums, Wikipedia, YouTube, online communities. Suddenly, expertise became more accessible than ever before. This changed something fundamental: authority itself. Psychologists studying learning have long observed that people become more analytical when information is abundant but inconsistent. When every question produces hundreds of different answers, the brain starts evaluating sources instead of simply accepting them. This doesn't automatically make people more skeptical, but it does encourage verification, comparison, research. Many millennials developed habits of fact-checking, reading reviews, and comparing perspectives before making decisions. Not because they distrusted everyone, but because they grew up surrounded by more information than any previous generation in history. Ironically, unlimited information also created unlimited uncertainty, because more answers often produce even more questions. And nowhere did that become more psychologically powerful than in the way millennials began thinking about mental health itself. For many older generations, emotional struggles often remained private. Anxiety was dismissed as worrying too much. Depression was mistaken for weakness. Burnout was considered part of being an adult. Seeking therapy carried a stigma that discouraged many people from asking for help. Millennials grew up during a period when that conversation began to change. Psychologists, educators, and mental health advocates increasingly encouraged people to talk openly about emotional well-being. Schools introduced discussions about stress. Workplaces began recognizing burnout. Therapy became more visible through books, podcasts, documentaries, and online conversations. Some critics argue that millennials simply talk about mental health too much, but psychology offers another perspective. Naming an experience doesn't necessarily create it. Sometimes it simply makes the invisible visible. When people finally have language for what they're feeling, they're more likely to recognize it and more willing to seek support. That doesn't mean every emotional challenge requires a diagnosis, nor does it mean previous generations experienced fewer struggles. It may simply mean that millennials were raised during a time when emotional experiences became easier to discuss. The conversation changed, and with it, the willingness to ask for help. Human beings have always made choices, but millennials inherited something previous. Generations rarely faced, an almost unlimited number of them. Dating apps made thousands of potential partners visible. Remote work expanded career possibilities across countries. Social media exposed entirely different lifestyles every single day. Streaming platforms offered endless entertainment. Online education opened countless new skills. At first, unlimited choice sounds like freedom. Yet psychologists have long observed a paradox. When choices become overwhelming, satisfaction doesn't always increase. Instead, people often begin wondering about the options they didn't choose. Could there have been something better? This doesn't mean millennials are incapable of commitment. It means many decisions now involve far more variables than they once did. Relationships compete with careers. Cities compete with opportunities. Personal goals compete with family expectations. Modern life asks people to optimize nearly everything. The human brain, however, still carries psychological mechanisms shaped long before endless scrolling and infinite options existed. When people describe millennials as entitled, or anxious, or adaptable, or indecisive, they're often describing the visible outcomes of invisible environments. Psychology teaches us a simple but powerful truth. People adapt, not just biologically, psychologically. Every generation inherits a different world. That world quietly shapes how people define success, build relationships, approach work, handle uncertainty, and even understand themselves. Millennials didn't grow up in the same psychological landscape as their parents, so expecting identical behaviors ignores one of psychology's most fundamental principles. Human behavior is deeply influenced by context. Understanding a generation doesn't require agreeing with every trend. It requires understanding the environment that produced it And perhaps that's the most important lesson. This video was never just about millennials. It was about all of us. Whether you belong to Generation X, Generation Z, baby boomers, or Generation Alpha, your mind has also been shaped by forces you rarely notice: technology, economics, culture, family, education, history. They quietly become part of the lens through which you see the world. The question isn't whether your generation changed you, the question is, how? If today's environment is shaping the psychology of tomorrow's adults, what do you think will define Generation Alpha? Share your thoughts below, and if you're curious about the hidden forces that shape human behavior, subscribe to the Shadow Mind, because sometimes the most powerful influence on your mind is the one you never notice.